The ground shakes violently as the thunderous roar of German tanks rips through the French countryside. The sky above is a dark blur of smoke and fire as bombers streak overhead, casting a shadow of doom on the earth below. In the midst of this chaos, Maurice Gamelin, France's chief of staff, stands frozen, watching the battlefield unfold in front of him. His maps, meticulously drawn, seem utterly useless now as the lines of defense he once believed impenetrable crumble under the weight of a relentless, lightning-fast German assault. The distant rumble of artillery grows louder, closer, and with each passing second, the fate of his command is sealed. Inside his command center, the air is thick with tension as officers rush about, shouting orders that are too little, too late. Gamelin's mind races, but his body remains still, as if caught in the grip of uncertainty. The room is suffocating with the weight of responsibility, and yet time seems to stretch, every moment more critical than the last. His heart pounds in his chest. He has just 60 seconds to act, but hesitation grips him. His every decision feels like it could be the one that tips the balance, but the situation is slipping beyond his control. The minutes drag on, each second an eternity. Was this a chain of unfortunate events that spiraled out of his control, or was it simply inevitable? Could any leader in any time have done anything different, or was Gamelin's failure written into the very fabric of the French military strategy? The German Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, was a military revolution, an unrelenting, fast-paced assault designed to overwhelm and destroy. By 1940, the Wehrmacht had perfected this tactic, deploying a combination of tanks, aircraft, and infantry working in perfect harmony. The speed and ferocity of this approach were like nothing the French had seen before. The Germans didn't just invade, they surged forward, moving faster than any conventional warfare could anticipate. For Maurice Gamelin and the French High Command, the Blitzkrieg was a nightmare come to life. France, on the other hand, was still locked in a time of static defenses, believing in the strength of fixed fortifications and slow, methodical warfare. For years, French military doctrine had been shaped by the experiences of World War I, where battles were often fought in a slow, grinding fashion. The idea of total mobility, rapid attacks, and a dynamic front was foreign to them. The French had invested heavily in defensive fortifications, notably the Maginot Line, expecting it to be an impenetrable shield. But this was no ordinary invasion. The Germans didn't bother trying to force their way through the line. Instead, they bypassed it entirely, sweeping through the Ardennes forest, a region believed to be impassable by a mechanized army. It was a stroke of genius on the part of the Germans, and one that caught the French completely off guard. As German tanks began to churn through the dense woods of the Ardennes and rush toward the Meuse River, Gamelin and his commanders were still grappling with a strategy designed for a different kind of war. The French High Command had anticipated a traditional battlefront, one where heavy artillery and infantry movements would gradually push the enemy back. Instead, the Germans were crossing rivers and advancing faster than the French could react. In the first hours of the assault, French officers scrambled to mobilize forces, but the Germans were already moving too quickly. As the Wehrmacht advanced, they used radio communication and concentrated airstrikes to keep the French disoriented and on the back foot. The German Luftwaffe bombed French airfields, immobilizing the French Air Force. Tanks, led by brilliant commanders like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, moved with incredible speed, penetrating the French lines like a hot knife through butter. By the time the French command realized the gravity of the situation, the Germans had already established multiple bridges over the Meuse, gaining a firm foothold in France's heartland. Gamelin, who had been expecting a battle of attrition, now found himself caught in a race against time. The speed at which the Germans struck was something that simply wasn't part of his plans. The 60 seconds that followed each critical decision seemed to stretch endlessly, as Gamelin faced an enemy that was not only outpacing him, but anticipating every move. The world had changed in a matter of hours, and France was left in the wake of a tactic it could neither comprehend nor match. As the battle unfolded, the question that loomed larger with every passing moment was whether Gamelin could adjust in time. Could his decisions, his reactions, make a difference? Or had the speed of the Blitzkrieg already sealed the fate of his command, and with it, France's future? The answer would come far too late to change the course of history, but it would be etched into the minds of all who witnessed the catastrophe. Maurice Gamelin, appointed as the chief of staff of the French army in the late 1930s, was a man whose career was built on tradition and method. His leadership style was deeply rooted in the belief that a well-organized, meticulously planned war could achieve victory. For Gamelin, war was a slow, measured effort. The French military had long adhered to the principles of methodical warfare, a strategy that relied on defensive fortifications and slow, deliberate troop movements. This approach, honed during the years of trench warfare in World War I, was thought to be the key to winning any future conflict. But the rise of the Blitzkrieg was the antithesis of everything Gamelin had trained for. His belief in careful, calculated maneuvers left him ill-prepared for the lightning-fast speed and aggression of the German assault. The German army, by contrast, embraced flexibility, speed, and surprise. They operated with an unrelenting sense of urgency, constantly shifting their forces, exploiting weaknesses, and forcing their enemies to react rather than plan. For Gamelin and his team, this wasn't just a new type of war. It was a total break from everything they had known. The French High Command, under Gamelin's direction, was hampered by outdated thinking and slow communication. Their reliance on static defenses, like the Maginot Line, led to a false sense of security. The French believed that once the Germans attacked, they would have the time to mobilize their forces and mount a successful defense. What they didn't account for was the speed with which the Germans would strike. The French army was, in many ways, still stuck in the previous century of warfare, slow to recognize the need for innovation. The breakdown in leadership was glaring. As the Germans advanced through the Ardennes and crossed the Meuse, the French command was slow to react. Gamelin and his fellow commanders were unable to quickly coordinate the massive French forces scattered across the battlefield. Communication between different branches of the military was slow, and there was a lack of clarity regarding how to respond to the rapidly changing situation. Gamelin's inability to adapt to the new reality of warfare was compounded by the fact that key officers like General Charles Hunziker and General Robert Altmaier often disagreed on how to proceed, creating confusion and delaying critical decisions. At the same time, the French army's morale plummeted. The soldiers, many of whom had been trained for a war of attrition, found themselves suddenly overwhelmed by the sheer speed and ferocity of the German attack. The higher-ups in the French military, like Gamelin, failed to provide the kind of leadership that would inspire the troops to keep fighting. Instead of offering decisive action or a rallying cry, Gamelin was trapped in indecision, unable to act quickly enough to halt the German advance. By May 13th, the situation had grown dire. Entire French armies were beginning to disintegrate as German forces made their way deeper into France. Despite his position of authority, Gamelin struggled to maintain control. His decision-making, once methodical, was now clouded by a growing sense of confusion. Even with the opportunity to strike back, Gamelin's hesitations kept him from giving the orders needed to counter the advancing German forces. The breakdown in leadership was no longer just a failure of military strategy, it was a failure of vision and command. As the German Blitzkrieg continued to tear through France, the question remained, was Gamelin's leadership to blame for the failure of the French military, or was he simply a victim of the unexpected and overwhelming speed of modern warfare? The events of May 1940 would soon prove that, despite his position and experience, Gamelin's inability to adjust to the changing tides of war had led to a catastrophic breakdown in French leadership, one that would have lasting consequences for the country. As the German Blitzkrieg tore through France in May 1940, the rapid and overwhelming speed of the German advance became the defining factor in the battle. The Wehrmacht, led by the brilliant tacticians Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, was not simply attacking. They were moving at a pace that left the French army reeling, unable to react in time. The speed of the German assault was unlike anything the French had ever faced, and it shattered the static, slow-moving strategies that the French command had relied upon for decades. The first shock came when the Germans bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line by pushing through the dense, seemingly impenetrable Ardennes forest. The French had long believed that this region was unsuitable for mechanized warfare. The narrow roads, dense trees, and rough terrain were thought to be too treacherous for the Germans to move their tanks and heavy equipment through. But the Germans proved this assumption disastrously wrong. With the use of light, fast-moving tanks and well-coordinated infantry support, the German forces blasted through the Ardennes in a matter of days, leaving French forces scrambling to respond. What made the German advance even more effective was the seamless integration of infantry, tanks, and air support. As German tanks charged through the forests, the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, dropped bombs on French positions, decimating both strategic targets and the morale of the French soldiers. German tanks, like the iconic Panzer, were fast, heavily armored, and equipped with powerful weapons that could cut through the French defenses with little resistance. These tanks weren't just attacking, they were part of a well-coordinated mobile offensive that made it impossible for the French to stop them in any meaningful way. By May 13th, the German forces had reached the Meuse River, one of France's major natural defenses. The French had believed that the river would be a formidable obstacle to the German advance, but the Germans swiftly crossed it, setting up bridges and establishing strong footholds deep within France. The speed with which they crossed the river was remarkable. Within a matter of hours, the Germans had crossed the Meuse and had begun pushing westward, while the French forces on the opposite side of the river were still trying to mobilize. While the Germans advanced, the French, by contrast, were moving in slow motion. Their heavy reliance on static defensive positions, slow infantry movements, and a rigid command structure meant that they were ill-prepared for the speed at which the Germans were advancing. French generals, including Gamelin, had underestimated the speed of modern warfare and the mobility of mechanized armies. The French had planned for a war that would unfold over months or even years, an attritional battle that would wear down the enemy's resources. What they didn't anticipate was the speed with which the Germans would cut through their lines and render their defenses obsolete. Gamelin's failure to recognize the urgency of the situation compounded the problem. While the Germans were already on the move, the French High Command was still scrambling to organize a defense. The Germans, capitalizing on their advantage in speed, pushed forward relentlessly, crossing vital locations, disrupting communication lines, and creating confusion within the French ranks. By the time French forces began to organize a counteroffensive, the Germans were already entrenched in key positions, making it virtually impossible to mount a meaningful response. The overwhelming speed of the German Blitzkrieg had left France with little room to maneuver. It was a war fought in real time, with the Germans making decisions and acting on them faster than the French could react. The French military, with its methodical approach, was simply not equipped to handle a war fought at this pace. For Maurice Gamelin and his officers, every decision made in those early hours felt like a race against time, and, more often than not, it was a race they were destined to lose. As the Germans continued their relentless march toward Paris, the question loomed. Was there any way for the French to have slowed the advance, or was the sheer speed of the German assault simply too much to overcome? The reality of the situation became clear. While the French struggled to catch up, the Germans had already set the course of the war. Time, it seemed, was the French military's greatest enemy. By May 13, 1940, the French army was in disarray. The stunning success of the German Blitzkrieg had shattered the French defensive lines, and the once proud military machine was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own strategic failures. Entire divisions, once thought to be impenetrable, were disintegrating, their soldiers fleeing or surrendering as German forces advanced with terrifying speed. What had once been a carefully constructed defense against invasion had become a crumbling facade, unable to withstand the onslaught of the German assault. The French military, already struggling with communication failures and a lack of coordination, was now completely overwhelmed. The rapid German advance had not only disrupted the French chain of command, but it had also caused a breakdown in the morale of both officers and soldiers alike. Reports of soldiers abandoning their posts, equipment left behind in the chaos, and commanders giving conflicting orders began to pour in. In the midst of the turmoil, Gamelin's inability to provide clear, decisive leadership became painfully evident. He had failed to adapt to the speed of modern warfare, and now France was paying the price for that failure. What was supposed to be a well-coordinated counterattack turned into a rout. As the Germans pushed forward, the French were left scrambling, trying to reorganize a defensive line that had already been shattered. The once formidable French armies, which had held the line for years, were now retreating in disorder, their ranks broken and morale shattered. The soldiers who had once stood resolute in defense of their homeland were now unsure of how to fight a war that was being waged on an entirely different level. In many cases, the men who had fought valiantly in World War I were now confronting an enemy whose tactics and speed they could not comprehend or combat. Gamelin, aware that the situation was rapidly slipping out of control, struggled to coordinate any meaningful response. But by then, the damage was done. German forces, led by commanders like Rommel, were already deep inside France. The French lines had been torn apart, and the German tanks and infantry pressed forward relentlessly. The French were simply too slow to react. Even when French commanders attempted to regroup their forces and counterattack, the Germans were always one step ahead. As the German forces continued to advance, the psychological toll on the French soldiers became evident. Many had never seen such swift and overwhelming force. The soldiers, who had expected to fight a traditional war of attrition, now found themselves outmatched by an enemy that had completely upended the rules of warfare. The once confident soldiers, many of whom had been through the horrors of World War I, were left stunned and demoralized. The French army, known for its discipline and strength, was now fractured, its soldiers caught between the overwhelming might of the German offensive and the crumbling leadership at the top. For Maurice Gamelin, this collapse must have been a devastating blow. As the commander-in-chief, he bore ultimate responsibility for the failures on the battlefield. While it was clear that the German tactics had caught the French by surprise, it was equally clear that the French command, under Gamelin's direction, had failed to recognize the changing nature of warfare. The slow, methodical strategies that had worked in the past were utterly ineffective against the lightning-fast Blitzkrieg. What had once been an army prepared to endure had become an army running for survival. By May 15th, France was on the brink of total defeat. The last vestiges of the French military's resistance were crumbling as the German forces pushed toward Paris. The once proud French army was now a shadow of its former self, and the collapse of the nation seemed imminent. Maurice Gamelin, trapped in indecision and unable to act decisively, was forced to confront the reality of his failure. The once great military machine that had been the pride of Europe was now a broken shell, unable to withstand the pressure of modern warfare. The collapse of the French army was not just a military defeat, it was a psychological and emotional blow that would resonate throughout the country for years to come. The men who had fought for France and the leadership that had failed to guide them would forever be remembered for their inability to prevent the collapse. The question that remained was whether anything could have been done to stop it, or if the speed and precision of the German Blitzkrieg had made defeat inevitable. By May 15, 1940, the French military leadership had been forced to face the unthinkable. The battle had been lost. France, once the cornerstone of European power, was now teetering on the brink of collapse. The French Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, had delivered the devastating news to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. France had been defeated. It wasn't a question of whether France could still hold on, but rather when the final surrender would occur. The realization that their once great military had crumbled so quickly left the French leadership reeling. This moment marked the point of no return, the absolute turning of the tide in the Battle of France. For Maurice Gamelin, the full weight of the situation must have been unbearable. As the chief of staff, he was supposed to be the guiding hand that would lead France to victory. But instead, he was now the face of France's failure, trapped in a situation where there was little he could do to alter the outcome. His hesitation, his inability to act quickly when the Germans first attacked, had set the stage for the complete disintegration of French forces. Now, Gamelin was forced to watch as the nation he served was swiftly crushed under the weight of the German offensive. The news of the defeat spread like wildfire across France. The soldiers on the front lines, who had already been demoralized by the constant German advances, now realized that the leadership they had followed was crumbling. Soldiers who had fought valiantly just days earlier began to question their own resolve. The civilian population, once confident that France could withstand the invasion, now faced the grim reality that their country was losing the war. People in towns and cities across France began to panic, fearing that the German forces would soon be at their doorstep. As Gamelin continued to grapple with the scope of the collapse, the question on everyone's mind was, how did it happen so quickly? How had the mighty French army, once thought to be the strongest on the continent, been overwhelmed in just a matter of days? The answer lay not just in the speed and power of the German Blitzkrieg, but in the failure of French leadership to react in time. The Germans had exploited every weakness in the French defense, moving faster, striking harder, and outthinking their opponents at every turn. But the French command, led by Gamelin, had been unable to adjust to the new reality of modern warfare. Gamelin's indecision, his reliance on outdated strategies, and his inability to communicate effectively with his subordinates all played a critical role in the collapse. In the coming days, as France fell deeper into chaos, the consequences of these failures became even more apparent. Gamelin, who had once been seen as a brilliant military leader, was now seen as a symbol of everything that went wrong. His inability to respond to the rapidly changing battlefield was a bitter pill for many to swallow. The French military, so proud in its history, was now a broken entity, and Maurice Gamelin's legacy was forever tarnished by the crushing defeat. For the world outside of France, the news of France's defeat was equally shocking. Many had believed that France, with its immense resources, fortified positions, and experienced military leadership, could hold off the Germans. But in the face of the German Blitzkrieg, the French military had faltered. The shock waves of this defeat would ripple through Europe and the world, altering the course of the war and shifting the balance of power. For the French people, the defeat was not just a loss on the battlefield, it was a devastating blow to their national pride and identity. As Gamelin and the French leadership faced the consequences of their failure, they were left to wonder if there had been any way to prevent the collapse. Could they have reacted faster? Could they have adapted to the new speed of warfare in time to mount an effective defense? The tragic irony was that by the time Gamelin and his commanders realized the depth of the problem, it was already too late. The defeat had been sealed by a lack of timely decision-making, a failure to adjust to a rapidly changing battlefield, and a leadership structure that couldn't keep up with the speed of the Blitzkrieg. By May 15th, France was no longer fighting to win, it was fighting to survive. The question now was how long it would take for the country to fully collapse and whether the French people could find a way to rebuild after the devastation that had swept through their nation. The turning point had arrived, and with it, the final unraveling of France's resistance to the German invasion. As the German forces continued their relentless advance through France, one of the most critical failures in the French defense was the inability to act upon timely intelligence. The Ninth Army, positioned in key areas of the front, had been the first to report the full extent of the German breakthrough. But their reports, critical to understanding the scope of the attack and coordinating an appropriate response, were delayed, ignored, or misinterpreted by the French High Command. What could have been a crucial piece of intelligence in preventing or slowing the German advance instead became one more tragic missed opportunity. The Ninth Army was stationed in one of the most vulnerable regions of the French defensive lines, and as the German forces broke through the Ardennes, they began to push toward the Meuse River. As soon as they encountered German forces advancing with speed and precision, the Ninth Army sent reports to Gamelin and the High Command warning of the breakthrough. The commanders on the ground recognized the urgency of the situation, but by the time their messages reached the Central Command, the situation had already begun to deteriorate. The delay in communication, coupled with a lack of clarity in the messages, created confusion at the top levels of French leadership. Gamelin and his fellow generals, already overwhelmed by the speed of the German offensive, were now faced with incomplete or delayed information. Reports from the front lines should have triggered an immediate response, reinforcements, repositioning, or countermeasures. But instead, the French High Command was slow to react. The delay in these reports meant that by the time Gamelin understood the severity of the situation, the Germans had already gained a foothold deep inside France. The initial intelligence, which could have been used to organize a more effective defense or even launch a counterattack, was now irrelevant. The Germans had already seized key positions, and the French forces were left scrambling to catch up. This failure to act on the Ninth Army's warnings was symptomatic of a broader issue within the French military command, a lack of effective communication and coordination. The French High Command was simply not prepared to handle the speed and complexity of modern warfare. The communication breakdowns were not limited to just the Ninth Army's reports. In fact, reports from various French units that could have provided valuable insight into German movements were often delayed, misdirected, or disregarded due to the chaos on the front lines. This lack of timely intelligence and the failure to act on it was a critical factor in the French collapse. Gamelin, in particular, was hampered by his inability to make quick decisions based on incomplete or delayed information. Throughout the early stages of the German offensive, he had been caught in a constant struggle to make sense of the situation, which only worsened as the hours passed. He was aware that the reports from the Ninth Army were critical, but by the time they reached him, the battle had already shifted in the Germans' favor. The enemy, moving with precision, had already outflanked the French, and it was too late for Gamelin to organize a counter-strategy. The French were no longer fighting to win, they were fighting to stave off total collapse. The consequences of these failures were catastrophic. The Ninth Army, like other French units, found itself under assault from all sides. Without the necessary reinforcements or a coordinated response, the army was forced into retreat, its lines completely broken. The troops that had once been positioned to hold the Germans back were now scattered and disoriented. The lack of timely response to the Ninth Army's reports contributed to the disintegration of the entire French defensive effort. The French command's failure to act on the crucial intelligence from the Ninth Army is a sobering reminder of how delays and miscommunications can unravel an entire military strategy. It also highlights the massive difference in speed between the French and German military operations. The Germans, using radio communication and rapid mobility, were able to exploit the slightest gaps in the French defense, whereas the French struggled with outdated communication systems and slow decision-making. The result was a breakdown in command that ultimately sealed France's fate. As the French army fell into chaos, the questions began to mount. Could the Ninth Army's reports have made a difference? If the French had reacted in time, could the collapse have been avoided or at least delayed? The haunting truth was that the failure to act quickly enough, even with vital intelligence, had compounded the other weaknesses in the French command. By the time the reports reached Gamelin, the Germans were already well on their way to victory, and France was left to deal with the consequences of a command structure that simply couldn't keep up. As the German forces surged forward and French resistance crumbled, one of the most painful aspects of the French defeat in 1940 was the missed opportunities for counterattacks. At several points during the battle, the French had the chance to strike back at the German advance, chances that, if seized, might have slowed the enemy's momentum or even halted their progress temporarily. However, due to confusion, indecision, and lack of coordination, these opportunities were squandered, leading to the irreversible collapse of the French defenses. One of the most critical moments came early in the German advance, when the French command had the chance to mount a significant counteroffensive. Despite the overwhelming speed of the German Blitzkrieg, the French still had a considerable number of troops positioned along key areas of the front. If these forces had been coordinated properly, they could have mounted a strong enough defense to delay or even push back the Germans at certain vulnerable points. However, French commanders, including General Gamelin, were trapped in a web of indecision, unable to make the swift, bold decisions necessary in the face of such a rapidly unfolding crisis. The French High Command's inability to react decisively was exacerbated by a critical lack of unity among the various branches of the military. French forces in the field were scattered, with different commanders often operating independently without proper coordination. For example, General Charles Hunziker, who was in charge of the French forces defending the area around Sedan, had the opportunity to organize a coordinated counterattack when the Germans made their initial breakthrough. But due to miscommunication and delays in receiving reinforcements, Hunziker's forces were left isolated and unable to press the attack effectively. What could have been a decisive move to slow the German advance turned into a defensive struggle that only delayed the inevitable. Another missed opportunity came when French forces on the southern front were positioned to threaten the German supply lines. These forces, under the command of General Jean-Baptiste Collet, could have launched an assault aimed at disrupting the German supply routes and slowing their advance. Such an attack could have had a significant impact, forcing the Germans to divert resources to protect their logistical lines. However, once again, indecision and a lack of coordination among the French leadership prevented this attack from taking place. The failure to strike when the opportunity was ripe allowed the Germans to maintain their momentum, and the chances of a French recovery began to fade. As the Germans pushed deeper into France, even the briefest moments of French resistance were crushed under the weight of their mechanized forces. The French command, still attempting to adjust to the realities of modern warfare, was slow to respond to emerging threats and missed every opportunity to gain an advantage. The Germans, on the other hand, had adapted quickly to the changing nature of war. Their ability to exploit gaps in the French lines, coordinate rapid attacks, and use combined arms tactics to overwhelming effect meant that French forces were constantly on the defensive, scrambling to keep up. Gamelin's failure to coordinate a counterattack during these crucial moments has been a point of much debate among historians. While some argue that the speed and efficiency of the German offensive left little room for any effective response, others believe that if Gamelin had acted more decisively, if he had managed to pull together a unified French strategy, the collapse could have been delayed, or at least contained for a longer period. Had the French counterattacked during those early critical moments, it could have forced the Germans into a prolonged battle, one that might have cost them valuable time and resources. But this lack of decisive action was not just about missed opportunities on the battlefield. It was a reflection of a deeper problem within the French high command. Gamelin and his officers were stuck in a mindset that believed in the slow and deliberate pace of a traditional war. They simply could not adjust to the fact that they were facing a new kind of warfare, one in which speed, surprise, and mobility were the keys to success. The missed counterattacks were not merely tactical errors. They were indicative of the broader failure of French military leadership to recognize and react to the Blitzkrieg's pace. As the German forces continued to advance, it became increasingly clear that France had missed its last real chance to turn the tide. Each moment of indecision, each opportunity ignored, brought the country one step closer to its ultimate defeat. The French army, once capable of formidable resistance, had been undone by a combination of outdated strategies, poor coordination, and an inability to recognize when the time had come to act decisively. The failure to mount a successful counterattack was just one of many mistakes that led to the collapse of the French military in 1940, and it highlighted the tragic consequences of leadership that could not adapt to the brutal new realities of modern warfare. As the German forces pressed on toward Paris, the psychological toll on Maurice Gamelin was immense. For a man who had spent his entire career preparing for the rigors of command, this was a test that no amount of training could have adequately prepared him for. Gamelin was not only facing the overwhelming speed and ferocity of the German Blitzkrieg, but also the growing realization that he had failed in his leadership role at the most critical moment in French history. His hesitation, his failure to act swiftly, and the collapse of the French defense would leave him forever marked by the consequences of his decisions. In the days following the initial German breakthroughs, Gamelin must have felt the weight of each delay more acutely. His role as chief of staff meant that he bore the responsibility for the entire French military strategy, and the disaster unfolding before him was directly tied to his leadership. Gamelin was a man of intellect and method, and his slow, deliberate approach to warfare had once been seen as a strength. But in the face of the rapidly evolving German offensive, that same methodical approach had become a crippling disadvantage. The psychological conflict that must have raged inside Gamelin is almost unimaginable. He knew that every second of hesitation was costing France dearly, yet he was unable to overcome the inertia that had paralyzed his leadership. As the French army collapsed around him, Gamelin's failure to take decisive action led to an internal struggle between his sense of duty and the reality of his situation. On one hand, he had always prided himself on his careful, reasoned decision-making. On the other hand, the Blitzkrieg had shown the world that war no longer waited for careful deliberation. It demanded swift, bold decisions. Gamelin, unable to adapt quickly enough to this new kind of warfare, must have been haunted by the knowledge that, while he had been trying to maintain order and control, his hesitation had allowed the Germans to gain the upper hand. This inner turmoil was compounded by the increasing chaos around him. As reports of broken lines and retreating soldiers filled his command center, Gamelin must have felt a sense of helplessness. His role as a leader was to direct and organize the defense, but with each passing day, it became clear that the situation was slipping beyond his control. The weight of responsibility, knowing that the fate of millions of people rested on his shoulders, only added to the pressure. France was not simply losing a battle, it was on the verge of losing its identity, its pride, and its place in Europe. Gamelin had long seen himself as the protector of that legacy, but in those critical moments he could do little more than watch as it crumbled. In the face of such overwhelming adversity, it is difficult to imagine how Gamelin could have remained unaffected by the psychological toll. He was, after all, only human. His decisions, though carefully made, were ultimately not enough to stop the German advance. And as the French High Command failed to adapt to the new realities of war, Gamelin must have felt the sharp sting of failure in every passing moment. He knew that the collapse of the French army and the subsequent fall of France would be attributed to his leadership, and that realization would haunt him for the rest of his life. The emotional burden of failure was not just professional for Gamelin, it was deeply personal. Gamelin was a man who had dedicated his entire life to the service of France, and the loss of his country's military strength in such a rapid, catastrophic manner would have struck at the core of his identity. It wasn't just that the war was lost, it was that he, as the man in charge, had failed his nation at the most crucial juncture. The weight of this failure would be a source of profound shame and guilt for him in the years to come. In many ways, Gamelin's psychological breakdown was a microcosm of the broader French defeat. The French army, with its once stalwart pride and its sense of invulnerability, was now left shattered and demoralized, and Gamelin, too, found himself shattered in the face of an enemy that had been too fast, too ruthless, and too prepared. As the Germans closed in on Paris, Gamelin's role as the military leader of France became a symbol of the nation's inability to adapt to modern warfare. The psychological toll on him was not just about personal failure, but the larger sense of helplessness that came with witnessing a once great military power disintegrate before his eyes. What could Gamelin have done differently? Could he have overcome his own hesitation? Could his leadership have changed the course of the war? These are questions that will never have definitive answers. But one thing is clear. Gamelin's personal and professional decline mirrored the downfall of the French army, and the psychological burden he carried in those final moments would be a weight he would never fully escape. The aftermath of the Battle of France was devastating, both for the French military and for Maurice Gamelin, who was dismissed from his position as Chief of Staff just days after the collapse. For France, the defeat was total. The German Blitzkrieg had broken the French army in a matter of weeks, and by June 22, 1940, the French would sign an armistice with Nazi Germany, marking the beginning of a long period of occupation. For Gamelin, the events of May 1940 would haunt him for the rest of his life. His failure to respond decisively in the early days of the German assault would be his lasting legacy in the eyes of history. While Gamelin's military career came to a swift and ignoble end, the question of his responsibility for France's defeat is still debated by historians. Some argue that Gamelin was a victim of circumstance, a leader who was caught off guard by the speed and brutality of the German attack, facing a tactical revolution in warfare that he could not adapt to in time. Others point to his hesitations, his reliance on outdated strategies, and his failure to communicate effectively with his subordinates, suggesting that his leadership played a critical role in France's catastrophic collapse. What remains clear, however, is that the failure of the French High Command, including Gamelin, was central to the rapid disintegration of French resistance. Gamelin's downfall, in many ways, mirrored the broader collapse of the French military. Just as France's once strong defensive lines crumbled under the German Blitzkrieg, Gamelin's leadership faltered when it was most needed. The battle was not just a failure of military strategy, it was a failure of leadership and a failure to adapt to the new realities of warfare. The rapid pace of the German advance, coupled with the inadequacy of French leadership, created a perfect storm that the French army was unable to weather. But the true tragedy of Gamelin's role in this defeat lies in the missed potential for recovery. The French army had considerable resources and manpower, and in the early days of the German assault, there were still moments when the tide could have been turned. There were opportunities to regroup, reorganize, and counterattack, but Gamelin's indecision and his inability to see the situation for what it was prevented France from taking advantage of them. The failure to act decisively in the first days of the battle, the inability to recognize the speed of modern warfare, and the lack of coordination among French forces all contributed to the rapid collapse. Had Gamelin acted more swiftly, perhaps France could have at least delayed the German advance long enough to regroup and counterattack. Instead, the French forces were left reeling, unable to adjust to a war that was being fought at an unimaginable speed. In the years following the defeat, Gamelin's reputation remained controversial. Some viewed him as a tragic figure, a man who had been thrust into a rapidly changing world of warfare and simply could not adapt in time. Others saw him as a failure of leadership, a symbol of everything that went wrong in the French military during the early days of World War II. For many, Gamelin was not just a victim of a fast-moving enemy. He was a man who was unable to confront the new realities of war. His downfall, some argue, was less about external circumstances and more about his inability to recognize that the world had changed. While Gamelin's career as a military leader ended in disgrace, the lessons of his failure remain relevant to military leaders and historians today. The battle for France in 1940 highlighted the dangers of rigid thinking and the importance of flexibility in leadership. The world was changing, and so too were the methods of warfare. The speed of the German Blitzkrieg demanded a new kind of leader, one who could think quickly, act decisively, and adapt to an ever-evolving battlefield. Gamelin's failure to do so was not just a personal flaw, but a flaw that ran throughout the French military leadership. The French army, once one of the most powerful in Europe, was undone by its inability to keep up with the speed and innovation of modern warfare. In the end, the question that lingers is not just whether Gamelin could have done better, but whether anyone could have. Could any leader, given the circumstances, have stopped the tide of the Blitzkrieg? Could the French military have overcome the advantages the Germans had in terms of speed, coordination, and technological superiority? While the answer may never be fully clear, one thing is certain: the Battle of France, and Maurice Gamelin's role in it, stands as one of the most significant military failures of the 20th century. It serves as a cautionary tale for military leaders about the dangers of complacency, the importance of adaptability, and the high cost of indecision in the face of overwhelming force. The collapse of France in 1940 marked not just a military defeat, but a profound national trauma. For Maurice Gamelin, the man responsible for the French defense, the legacy of the Battle of France would forever be one of failure and lost opportunity. But as time passed, the narrative around his actions became more complex. Was Gamelin simply the unfortunate scapegoat of a doomed military strategy? Or was he the embodiment of a deeper, systemic flaw in the French command structure? The legacy of Gamelin's leadership and the defeat of France in World War II remains a subject of intense historical reflection, revealing not only the limitations of a man, but also the failures of a nation unable to adapt to the rapid pace of modern warfare. In the years following the defeat, Maurice Gamelin's reputation was largely tarnished. Dismissed from his post in disgrace, Gamelin lived out the rest of his life in relative obscurity. For many, he remained the symbol of France's downfall in 1940, a man who failed to recognize the speed of modern warfare and was too slow to act in the face of the German Blitzkrieg. Yet, even as his personal reputation suffered, his actions continued to be the subject of deep debate. Was he simply a victim of circumstance, caught off guard by a rapidly changing battlefield? Or was he the chief architect of France's collapse, too entrenched in outdated tactics and a slow-moving command structure to save his country? In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Gamelin was heavily criticized by the French public, the media, and, most notably, by his fellow military leaders. His failure to act swiftly during the critical days of the German offensive, combined with his hesitancy and inability to adapt, became emblematic of the French High Command's broader deficiencies. The fact that France's collapse occurred so swiftly, despite the country's significant military resources, was shocking. To many, it seemed that the entire French military apparatus had failed in its most fundamental duty, to protect the nation from invasion. Yet, in hindsight, historians have come to view Gamelin's actions within a broader context. Some argue that Gamelin, though certainly responsible for many of the failures, was not entirely to blame for the French defeat. The rapid pace of the German Blitzkrieg, combined with the overwhelming speed and coordination of their forces, left the French command with little room to maneuver. Gamelin, in many ways, was leading an army that was still operating under the assumptions of a previous era. The French military, while powerful, had been trained to fight in a slow, methodical manner that was utterly incompatible with the speed and flexibility of the German forces. Moreover, the political and strategic environment in which Gamelin was operating was far from ideal. The French government was deeply divided, and France's military strategy was marked by confusion and internal conflict. Gamelin was not working in a vacuum. He was the leader of a military system that was out of touch with modern warfare. The failure of communication between different branches of the military, combined with Gamelin's own hesitation and indecision, created a perfect storm of failure. The blame for France's defeat, some historians argue, should be shared by many, including the French political leadership, which failed to provide clear direction, and the French generals, who were unable to coordinate their efforts effectively. Despite these extenuating factors, the sense of national shame following the French collapse in 1940 remained powerful. The fall of France was seen not just as a military loss, but as a humiliating blow to the national pride of a country that had long prided itself on its military prowess. For Gamelin, this was not just a loss of position, it was a loss of identity. He had staked his career on the belief that France could withstand any enemy, yet the events of May 1940 showed how quickly that belief could crumble under the force of modern warfare. As time passed and France moved through its occupation by Nazi Germany, Gamelin's role in the defeat began to take on a more complex character. He was no longer just the scapegoat of a failed military campaign, but a man who had witnessed the collapse of his country firsthand. In his later years, Gamelin attempted to reconcile with his role in the defeat, writing about the lessons learned from France's failure. Yet, for many, these attempts at reflection did little to undo the lasting impact of the collapse. His failure to adapt to modern warfare and the catastrophic consequences of that failure became his enduring legacy. The legacy of Gamelin and the French defeat in 1940 is, in many ways, a story of missed opportunities, flawed leadership, and the harsh realities of modern warfare. The lessons learned from this defeat would go on to shape military strategy for decades. For Gamelin, however, the greatest lesson was one that he had failed to grasp in time, that warfare was changing, and only leaders who could adapt to that change would have a chance of success. The Blitzkrieg was not just a new tactic, it was a new kind of war, one that left no room for hesitation or indecision. Gamelin's story is a somber reminder that in war, as in life, timing is everything. The legacy of his failure is not just in the mistakes he made, but in the missed moments, those critical seconds when a different decision could have changed the course of history. As France rebuilt after the war, the nation learned from its past mistakes, and so did the world. The story of Maurice Gamelin, while tragic, became a cautionary tale for military leaders in the decades to come. In the face of overwhelming speed and modern tactics, hesitation is often the most costly mistake of all.